I ran EMS for 3 years. I can talk and carry a backboard uphill simultaneously. Do you sleep heavy? No. Good. You won't need to change that. He wrote something on a form I couldn't read. How close is your nearest family? I was there the night we saved the world. I need you to understand that before anything else. I was standing in Lab 4 of the Meridian Biosciences Complex in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, wearing a wrinkled button-down I hadn't changed in 31 hours, watching Dr. Lena Marchetti inject the final trial subject with compound MRD-11. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent song. The subject, a 26-year-old former Marine named Davis, who'd been bitten 19 hours prior, sat on the edge of a steel examination table with his forearm wrapped in gauze, already browning at the edges. His pupils had started to cloud. The capillary bloom along his neck was visible from across the room. He had maybe 4 hours before full conversion. I'm Dr. Amir Nassar, Immunological Research. 12 years at Meridian, the last 3 devoted entirely to Project Bastion, the emergency federal initiative to develop a viable countermeasure against the Lazarus pathogen. The infection that turned human beings into something the news anchors couldn't bring themselves to name for the first 6 weeks. The thing that collapsed 17 national governments in 4 months. You know what it did? You lived through it? Or you're listening to this because someone you loved didn't. Lena pressed the plunger with a steady hand that had made her the best virologist I'd ever worked alongside. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. She withdrew the needle, capped it, set it on the steel tray, and looked at the monitor without a word. We waited. Marcus Cole, our lead computational biologist, stood beside the data terminal with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Behind him, through the reinforced observation glass, I could see the rest of the core team. Dr. Priya Venkatesh, our protein engineer, chewing the edge of her thumbnail. Tom Rourke, head of logistics and the only non-scientist among us, pacing near the far wall with his satellite phone pressed against his thigh like a weapon he wasn't sure how to use. 5 minutes. Davis's pulse, which had been climbing toward the erratic tachycardic pattern we'd learned to dread, began to slow. His pupil dilation reversed. The capillary bloom along his neck faded from mottled violet to irritated pink. At the 12-minute mark, he blinked, looked at Lena, and said, "Ma'am, I feel like I just woke up from the worst hangover of my life." Marcus made a sound I'd never heard a grown man make. Something between a laugh and a sob. Priya pressed both hands flat against the glass. Tom stopped pacing. Lena turned to me, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw her smile. That was it. That was the moment. MRD-11 worked. Not partially, not as a delay mechanism. It reversed active Lazarus infection in a living human subject. Full neurological restoration, full immune reset. The holy grail that every laboratory on the planet had been chasing since the first outbreak in Kuala Lumpur 18 months earlier. Within 72 hours, the Department of Defense had mobilized emergency manufacturing. Within 2 weeks, the first mass-produced doses of what the public would come to call Lazarin were being distributed to military field hospitals and civilian triage centers across North America. Within a month, the global mortality curve bent downward for the first time since the pandemic began. Within 3 months, organized infected hordes were being systematically neutralized, their numbers no longer replenished by fresh conversions. The tide turned. Civilization exhaled. We were heroes. All of us. The Meridian 6, the press called our core team. Lena, Marcus, Priya, Tom, myself, and Dr. Jonah Friedkin, our senior pathologist who'd done the foundational antigen mapping that made MRD-11 possible. There were magazine covers, congressional citations, a Nobel nomination for Lena that surprised no one. We had done it. We'd built the weapon that ended the war. I need you to hold that image in your mind. 6 people standing in a laboratory, saving the human race. Because what I'm about to tell you is what happened after. What the cameras never recorded. What the official narrative buried beneath the celebration. The vaccine worked on everyone. Every single person on Earth. Except us. Except the 6 people who created it. The first sign came 11 weeks after global distribution began. I was sitting in my apartment in Durham, eating reheated pad thai and watching a news segment about reconstruction efforts in Jakarta, when I noticed a bruise on my left forearm. It was small, roughly the size of a quarter, positioned just below the crease of my elbow. I hadn't bumped into anything. I hadn't drawn blood recently. The bruise was a deep, almost arterial purple. Something about its color made the back of my neck tighten. I told myself it was nothing. The body bruises. It's what bodies do. I finished my pad thai and went to bed. 2 days later, Lena called me at 6 in the morning. She didn't say hello. She said, Amir, I need you to come to the lab. Don't tell anyone. Her voice carried the particular flatness she reserved for moments when she was controlling fear so completely that it became invisible to everyone except the people who knew her well. I drove to Meridian in 12 minutes. The campus was quieter now. Half the research wings had been repurposed for manufacturing oversight. The parking lot where military convoys had once lined up was mostly empty. I badged through 3 security checkpoints and found Lena alone in Lab 4, standing in front of a light board displaying what I recognized immediately as blood panel results. She pointed. Mine, drawn this morning. She moved her finger to a second panel. Jonah's, drawn last night. He came to me because he was having headaches. I didn't need her to circle the anomalies. I could see them from 4 feet away. Elevated inflammatory markers. Irregular white cell morphology. And something else. Something that turned my stomach into a cold stone. A faint but unmistakable signature in the lymphocyte profile that I had seen hundreds of times in the past 3 years. Always in infected subjects. Always in the blood of people who'd been bitten. That's not possible, I said. Look at the T-cell subset analysis. I looked. The CD8 cytotoxic lymphocytes showed a binding pattern consistent with early-stage Lazarus antigen recognition, but the response was inverted. Instead of attacking the pathogen markers, the immune cells appeared to be incorporating them, integrating, as if the body was welcoming the infection rather than fighting it. This is subclinical, I said. There's no active viral load. Not yet. Lena pulled up a third panel. This is Marcus. He sent me his results an hour ago. Same pattern. Less pronounced, but identical trajectory. My hand went involuntarily to the bruise on my forearm. Lena watched me do it. Her expression didn't change. Draw your blood, she said. Now. I sat down, rolled up my sleeve, and let her work. Neither of us spoke while the centrifuge ran. When the results populated on the screen, I stared at them for a long time. The same inverted immune signature. The same lymphocytic integration pattern. Fainter than Lena's. Clearer than I wanted it to be. Have you told Priya? I asked. She called me last night. She's been having muscle tremors in her hands. She thought it was stress. Tom? I haven't reached him yet. He's in Washington for the Oversight Committee hearings. We stood in that lab, surrounded by the same equipment that had produced the cure. and we understood something that neither of us was ready to articulate. The Lazarus pathogen had not forgotten us. Our prolonged exposure during development, the months of handling live samples, the accidental needle sticks and aerosolized particles and contaminated surfaces, all of it had left a residue in our systems that MRD-11 could not reach. The vaccine functioned by teaching the immune system to recognize and destroy Lazarus antigens. But our immune systems had been so saturated during development that the antigens had become part of our biological architecture. The vaccine couldn't target them without targeting us. Lena sat on the edge of the examination table where Davis had sat the night we'd changed history. She pressed her fingers against her temples. "We need to tell someone," I said. "Who?" She looked at me. The people throwing us parades? The federal government that just staked the entire Reconstruction on our credibility? The public that finally stopped being afraid? We need help, Lena. We need to understand what we're dealing with first. Her voice carried no room for debate. We tell no one until we know exactly what this is. That was our first mistake. Jonah Friedkin was the oldest among us, 57, with a distinguished silver beard and the calm demeanor of a man who'd spent 3 decades staring at pathogens through microscopes without letting any of them rattle his composure. When I saw him in Lab 4 that afternoon, he was sitting in a rolling chair with his sleeves pushed up to his elbows, studying his own blood work on a tablet with the detached analytical focus he brought to every problem. But his hands were trembling. Not the fine motor tremor Priya was experiencing, something deeper, more structural, as though the muscles beneath his skin were receiving contradictory instructions. "It's progressing faster in me," he said without looking up. "Age, probably. Weaker baseline immune regulation. My body's accommodating the integration at a higher rate." Marcus arrived 20 minutes later. He was 6'3", built like a former college linebacker, which he was. And he entered the lab with the coiled energy of someone who wanted to hit something but couldn't find a target. He'd driven from his house in Chapel Hill at a speed I chose not to ask about. "Tell me this is a false positive," he said. "It's not," Lena replied. "Then tell me it's treatable." Lena pulled up the molecular model she'd been building for the past 4 hours. The holographic projection rotated slowly above the central workstation. A 3-dimensional map of the Lazarus antigen as it appeared in our bloodstreams versus how it appeared in standard infection cases. The difference was stark. In a normal infected subject, the virus operated as an invader, hijacking cellular machinery and reprogramming neural pathways toward aggression, reduced cognition, and the characteristic hunting behavior the public had learned to recognize. In our blood, the virus wasn't invading. It was merging, integrating at the chromosomal level like a retroviral insertion, rewriting small segments of our DNA in ways that were still too early to fully map. Standard Lazarus conversion takes between 18 and 48 hours after a bite, Lena said. What's happening to us isn't conversion. It's something else. Slower, more systemic. The pathogen is building itself into our biology piece by piece. "How long?" Marcus asked. "I don't know yet." "Guess." Lena's jaw tightened. "Based on Jonah's progression rate compared to mine and Amir's, I'd estimate the integration will reach critical threshold in 8 to 12 weeks for him. Longer for the rest of us. Maybe 16 to 20 weeks." The room absorbed that information like concrete absorbs rain. "And at critical threshold?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Full neurological conversion. Same endpoint, different path." Priya arrived that evening. She'd taken a train from Baltimore, where she'd been consulting with a manufacturing facility. She walked into the lab, holding her right hand with her left. the tremors visible even from across the room. She didn't ask questions. She looked at the data on the screens, at the molecular model rotating its slow accusation above the workstation. And she sat down and began working alongside Lena without a word. Tom Rourke was the last to join. He flew in from Washington on a red-eye and arrived at the lab at 4 a.m, still wearing the suit he'd worn to the congressional hearing. He looked at all of us, at the data arrays and blood samples, and the molecular model that had grown more detailed and more damning over the previous 12 hours. And he said the thing no one else had been willing to say. If this gets out, the entire Lazarin program collapses. That's not our primary concern, Lena said. It has to be one of our concerns. 3 billion doses have been administered worldwide. If the public learns that the creators of the vaccine are developing a variant infection, confidence evaporates. People stop taking their boosters. The remaining infected populations get reinforced. We're talking about a potential reversal of everything we accomplished. Silence held the room. I watched each face process the weight of what Tom was describing. He wasn't wrong. Public trust in Lazarin was the single most fragile pillar holding up the reconstruction. Anti-vaccine movements had already been probing for weaknesses. If news broke that the Meridian 6 were slowly transforming into the very thing their creation was designed to prevent, the psychological shockwave could be catastrophic. So what are you suggesting? Marcus asked, his voice dangerously low. Tom looked at him steadily. I'm suggesting we solve this ourselves. Quietly, and we solve it fast. That was the second mistake, agreeing with him. We converted sub-level 3 of the Meridian complex into a sealed research environment within 48 hours. Tom handled the cover story, an extension of the original Project Bastion mandate to study long-term vaccine efficacy, requiring restricted access and enhanced biosafety protocols. No one questioned it. We were the heroes. Heroes got what they asked for. The first week underground was productive in the way that terror makes people productive. Lena and Priya worked 18-hour shifts mapping the integration pathway, identifying the specific genetic loci where the Lazarus antigens were inserting themselves into our chromosomal structure. Marcus built predictive models, feeding the biological data through algorithms he'd originally designed to forecast infection spread patterns across urban populations. Jonah, despite his advancing symptoms, continued his pathological analysis with meticulous precision, cataloging every cellular change in his own tissue samples with the detachment of a man who'd made peace with using himself as a specimen. I focused on the immunological angle. If MRD11 couldn't target the integrated antigens without destroying our own cells, then we needed a modified approach, something that could distinguish between the original human genome and the Lazarus insertions. A molecular scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. The theoretical framework existed. Gene editing tools like CRISPR had been adapted during the pandemic for various therapeutic applications. But the precision required was staggering. We'd need to identify every insertion site, design guide sequences for each one, and deliver the editing machinery to every affected cell in the body simultaneously. It was like being asked to remove individual threads from a tapestry without disturbing the weave. Tom maintained our external facade. He attended meetings, signed reports, gave interviews. He was our mask, the smiling, confident public face of Meridian Biosciences, while the rest of us deteriorated in a basement laboratory, trying to undo what our own creation had done to us. By the second week, Jonah's tremors had migrated from his hands to his arms and shoulders. His gait developed an unsteadiness that he compensated for with a cane he'd fashioned from a metal equipment stand. More troubling were the cognitive episodes. Brief windows, lasting 30 seconds to 2 minutes, during which his eyes would lose focus and his speech would dissolve into a low, repetitive murmur. He'd snap out of them with no memory of the lapse. Lena recorded each episode with clinical precision, but I saw the fear she kept below the surface whenever Jonah drifted. Priya's hand tremors worsened and spread to her forearms. She adapted by using voice-controlled interfaces for her computational work, dictating commands and analysis parameters through a headset while her hands lay uselessly in her lap. Her mind remained razor-sharp, which made the physical decline more painful to witness. She was trapped inside a body that was slowly betraying her, fully aware of every stage of the betrayal. Marcus showed the fewest physical symptoms, but his blood work told a different story. The integration in his system was advancing at a rate comparable to Lena's, concentrated primarily in neural tissue. He reported vivid, intrusive dreams, waking episodes in which he could smell things that weren't present, hear frequencies outside normal human range. His senses were heightening in ways that aligned with early-stage Lazarus neural rewiring, the pathogen's method of converting its host into a more efficient predator. "I can hear your heartbeat," he told me one morning, standing 6 feet away in the corridor outside the lab. His expression was troubled but fascinated. Not just the rhythm, the valve movements, the blood flow. It's like someone turned up the resolution on everything. My own symptoms remained primarily dermatological. The bruise on my forearm had been joined by others, a constellation of deep purple marks spreading across my torso and limbs. Beneath them, I could feel a subtle heat, as though the tissue was being slowly reforged. My blood work showed the same integration pattern as the others, progressing at a moderate rate. I estimated I was 3 to 4 weeks behind Jonah. We were 6 people in a basement, trying to cure ourselves of the disease they'd already cured the world of. And we were losing. The breakthrough, if you could call it that, came on day 19. Priya identified a structural vulnerability in the Lazarus integration mechanism. The viral insertions weren't random. They followed a specific pattern, targeting regulatory regions of the genome that controlled immune response, neuroplasticity, and adrenal function. The virus was methodical. It was rewriting us according to a blueprint. "It's not just infection," Priya said, her voice steady through the headset as her trembling hands rested on the desk. "It's optimization. The pathogen is redesigning our biology for a specific outcome. The aggression, the heightened senses, the reduced cognitive inhibition, those aren't side effects. They're design specifications." The implications were staggering. The Lazarus pathogen wasn't a mindless virus. It was an engineering tool. Someone, or something, had designed it to convert human beings into a different kind of organism. The shambling, violent, infected that had terrorized the world weren't malfunctions. They were the intended product. But that revelation, however profound, didn't help us survive. What helped was the vulnerability Priya found. The insertion sequences all shared a common upstream promoter element, a genetic switch that regulated their activation. If we could target that switch, we could theoretically silence every insertion simultaneously without damaging the host genome. Lena seized on it immediately. She designed a modified viral vector, a delivery system that could carry a gene-silencing payload to every cell in the body, targeting only the Lazarus promoter element. It was elegant. It was theoretically sound. It would take weeks to synthesize and test. We didn't have weeks. Jonah was declining visibly by the day. On the 22nd night, I woke to the sound of alarms. The sub-level's internal security system was blaring, red emergency lights strobing in the corridor outside my makeshift sleeping quarters. I pulled on shoes and ran toward Lab 4. Marcus was already there, standing in the doorway with his enhanced hearing tilted toward the interior. His face told me everything before I looked inside. Jonah had turned. Not fully. Not the complete feral conversion we'd seen in standard cases. Something worse. Something partial and aware. He was crouched in the corner of the lab, his body contorted in a posture that was neither sitting nor standing, his hands gripping the edge of a workstation with enough force to bend the steel frame. His eyes were clouded, but not blank. There was recognition in them. Terror. He knew what was happening to him. Jonah. Lena stood 10 feet away, her hands raised, her voice carrying the controlled calm she'd used on hundreds of infected subjects during the development trials. Jonah, listen to my voice. He made a sound. Not a word. Not the guttural snarl of a fully converted infected. Something between a fractured vocalization that might have been her name, stretched and distorted through a throat that was no longer entirely human. "We can help you," Lena said. "The silencing vector. We can accelerate the timeline. But I need you to stay with me." His head jerked toward Marcus. The enhanced senses, the predatory instinct that the pathogen was installing in all of us, locked onto the largest presence in the room. Marcus didn't move. He stood with his feet planted and his arms at his sides, and I saw something cross his face that I recognized as the same heightened awareness he'd described to me. His own rewired neurology resonating with Jonah's. Predator recognizing predator. "Back up," Marcus said to me without breaking eye contact with Jonah. "Slowly." I took 3 steps backward into the corridor. Priya was behind me, her useless hands pressed against the wall for balance. Tom appeared at the far end of the hallway, still pulling on a jacket, his face white. "Is he?" Tom started. "Partial conversion," Priya whispered. The integration reached critical mass in his neural tissue. He's caught between states. Jonah lunged, not at Marcus. At the workstation beside him, slamming his fists into the surface with a violence that scattered equipment across the floor. Then he stopped, gasping, and pressed his forehead against the bent steel. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Kill me." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "Please." The word came out mangled but unmistakable. "Before I can't ask anymore." We didn't kill him. Lena refused. She sedated him with a cocktail of benzodiazepines and anticonvulsants, delivered through an emergency IV line that Marcus held steady while Jonah's body fought the restraints we'd improvised from equipment straps. It took 4 doses to bring him down. When he finally went still, his breathing ragged but stable, Lena checked his pupils and found them cycling, clouded one moment and clear the next, the infection and the man trading control in a rhythm that had no precedent in any literature we'd ever studied. We moved him to a sealed observation room on the far end of sub-level 3. Reinforced glass, magnetic locks. The same kind of containment cell we'd used for infected test subjects during development. The irony was so sharp, it cut without touching. Tom pulled me aside in the corridor, while the others settled Jonah's sedated form onto the observation room's medical cot. "We need to discuss contingencies," he said. "He's not dead, Tom. He asked us to kill him. Under duress, during a partial conversion episode that may be reversible. Maybe. That's not certainty. And what happens when the same thing occurs in Lena? In you? We need a protocol." I stared at him. Tom Rourke had never been a scientist. He was an administrator, a systems thinker. His value to the team had always been his ability to see the operational picture when the rest of us were buried in molecular details. That value had also made him ruthlessly practical in ways that sometimes felt inhuman, though I'd never questioned his intentions before this moment. "What kind of protocol?" I asked. "If someone reaches critical threshold and can't be sedated, if they become a danger to the rest of the team, we need to be prepared to act." "Act how, Tom? Spell it out." He held my gaze. "Containment first, always. But if containment fails, we need to be willing to do what's necessary to protect whoever's left." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that we were doctors and scientists, not executioners. That the moment we started preparing to destroy each other was the moment we'd already lost. But I couldn't make the words come, because in the private chambers of my own mind, in the space where honesty lived without the filters of morality and self-image, I knew he was right. We were changing, all of us, and the rate of change was accelerating. Lena emerged from the observation room and closed the door behind her. She looked at both of us with the evaluative precision that made her one of the finest scientific minds of her generation. "Jonah's stable for now," she said. "The sedation is holding, but I need to accelerate the silencing vector. If I can get a functional prototype within the next 72 hours, we might be able to arrest his integration before permanent conversion." "What do you need?" I asked. "Time, equipment, and both of you to stop looking at each other like you're choosing sides." She walked past us and disappeared into the primary lab. Marcus followed her. Priya was already there, dictating synthesis parameters through her headset, her trembling hands folded in her lap while her mind raced ahead of her body's collapse. I turned back to Tom. "We follow Lena's lead. We focus on the vector. That's the priority. And when the next one of us turns, then we contain, like we always have." He nodded slowly. But I saw something shift behind his eyes, a calculation being made that I wasn't privy to. Tom Rourke was a man who built systems, protocols, contingency plans nested inside contingency plans. He was already constructing the architecture for a scenario none of us wanted to name. I returned to the lab and threw myself into the immunological mapping with a desperation that felt new. Previously, the work had been driven by professional obligation and survival instinct. Now it was personal in a way that made my hands shake for reasons that had nothing to do with the Lazarus integration in my cells. Jonah's face, caught between human terror and predatory impulse, was burned into my memory with the permanence of a scar. 72 hours was optimistic. On the second day of accelerated synthesis, Lena discovered that the silencing vector required a protein scaffold that we couldn't manufacture with the equipment available in sub-level 3. The specific enzyme, a modified Cas13 variant that Priya had engineered during the original Project Bastion work, needed a bioreactor system that existed in only one location in the complex, Lab 7 on the main floor, 3 levels above us, in full view of the remaining Meridian staff and the federal oversight personnel, who still maintained a presence on campus. "I can modify the synthesis pathway," Priya said, her voice thinning with exhaustion through the headset. "Route around the Cas13 requirement. Use a zinc finger nuclease platform instead. That reduces targeting specificity by 40%, Lena replied. At that accuracy, we'd silence the Lazarus promoter in some cells and miss it in others. Partial treatment might be worse than no treatment. The surviving integrations could adapt, become resistant. Then we access Lab 7, Marcus said. The simplicity of his statement masked its implications. Accessing Lab 7 meant going upstairs, being seen, interacting with people who believed we were conducting routine follow-up research, people who would notice if we looked wrong, moved wrong, smelled wrong. People who might, if they were observant enough, recognized the early signs of Lazarus integration in the team that was supposed to be immune to it. "I'll go," Tom said. "I'm the least symptomatic. I can move through the building without raising questions. Just tell me what I need to bring back." It was true. Tom's blood work showed the slowest integration progression among all of us, possibly because his exposure during development had been less direct, confined to logistical handling rather than hands-on laboratory work. He showed no visible symptoms, no tremors, no bruising, no sensory anomalies. If anyone could pass as normal, it was him. Lena hesitated, then nodded. She wrote a detailed list of the equipment and reagents Tom would need to extract from Lab 7, including the bioreactor culture containing the modified Cas13 enzyme. She explained the handling procedures twice. Tom listened with the attentive focus of a man who understood that precision wasn't optional. He left through the sub-level access corridor at 7 in the morning, timed to coincide with the shift change when the fewest personnel would be in the main labs. We tracked his progress through the building's internal security feeds, which Marcus had rerouted to our workstation during the first week. Tom moved through the corridors with practiced ease. He badged through checkpoints. He nodded to a security guard. He stopped to exchange pleasantries with a facilities manager who recognized him. He was performing normalcy with the competence of a man who'd spent his entire career managing appearances. Watching the feed, I felt a complicated admiration twisted with unease. He reached Lab 7 without incident. The camera showed him entering the bioreactor room, locating the correct culture, and beginning the extraction process. It should have taken 15 minutes. It took 40. At the 20-minute mark, someone entered Lab 7 behind him. Dr. Sarah Whitfield, a junior researcher who'd been peripherally involved in the late stages of Project Bastion. She was carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who'd come looking for something specific. We couldn't hear the conversation. The security feeds had no audio, but we watched the body language. Sarah approaching, asking a question. Tom responding with casual deflection. Sarah pressing the point, showing him something on the tablet. Tom's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at the bioreactor culture he'd been extracting, then back at Sarah, and said something that made her frown. "What's she showing him?" Marcus muttered, leaning toward the screen. Priya enlarged the feed. The tablet was too small to read, but the document displayed on it appeared to be a data report. Sarah pointed at specific sections. Tom shook his head. Sarah's frown deepened. 5 minutes later, Tom left Lab 7 with the bioreactor culture sealed in a transport container. Sarah watched him go. She didn't follow, but she pulled out her phone and made a call. Tom returned to sub-level 3 at 8:45, slightly out of breath. He set the transport container on Lena's workstation. "We have a problem," he said. Sarah Whitfield had been running her own analysis, routine post-deployment monitoring of long-term Lazarin efficacy in vaccinated populations, standard follow-up work. But she'd noticed statistical anomalies in a specific subset of the data. The health records of the Meridian 6 themselves, which were supposed to be sealed, but which she'd accessed through an administrative oversight in the database permissions. She flagged irregular blood work, Tom said. Elevated inflammatory markers across all 6 of us. She doesn't know what it means yet. She thinks it might be a stress-related artifact. But she's curious. She wants to run additional panels. "Did she file a report?" Lena asked. "Not yet. She came to me first because she assumed it was her error. She wanted to check before escalating." "And what did you tell her?" "That we'd been under significant physical strain during the development phase, and that residual biomarkers were expected. That I'd look into it personally and get back to her." "Will she accept that?" Tom's pause was a fraction too long. For now. The room recalibrated around this new variable. Sarah Whitfield was not a threat. She was a conscientious scientist doing her job. But her curiosity, if it continued along its current trajectory, would lead her directly to the truth. And the truth, released into the ecosystem of post-pandemic reconstruction, was a pathogen of its own kind. Lena took the bioreactor culture and began the accelerated synthesis of the silencing vector without another word about Sarah. She couldn't afford the distraction. The vector construction required a precision that demanded her complete cognitive capacity. And I watched her work with the awareness that her own integration was advancing. That the mind performing these calculations was itself being slowly rewritten by the thing it was trying to defeat. Marcus pulled me aside in the corridor. His hearing had sharpened further in the past 48 hours. He spoke in a whisper that I had to strain to catch, knowing that his own ears would have picked it up from 3 rooms away. Tom didn't tell us everything about that conversation with Sarah. What do you mean? I could hear his heartbeat when he was talking. Elevated, irregular. Not the pattern of someone relaying bad news. The pattern of someone who's already decided what to do about it and doesn't want to share. I studied Marcus's face. The heightened perception the pathogen was granting him was turning him into something more than human in ways that were deeply unsettling. His eyes tracked micro-movements, analyzed vocal patterns, parsed physiological data that no normal person could access. He was becoming a living sensor array, and he was using those capabilities to monitor our team. You think Tom's planning something? I said. I think Tom is a man who manages risk. And right now, Sarah Whitfield is an unmanaged risk. He wouldn't. The Tom who started this project with us wouldn't. But how well do any of us know who we're becoming? The question hung between us like smoke. I thought of the changes in myself. The bruises deepening. The subtle shifts in my perception of temperature and light. The dreams that were becoming increasingly vivid and increasingly focused on movement, pursuit. The feeling of my body operating at capacities I'd never possessed. The Lazarus integration wasn't just physical. It was psychological, emotional. It was reshaping the architecture of thought itself. Keep watching him, I said to Marcus, and hated myself for it. Priya, meanwhile, had made her own discovery. Working through the night while the rest of us slept in fitful shifts. She'd analyzed Jonah's observation room footage and identified a pattern in his episodes of lucidity. They weren't random. They correlated with fluctuations in his cortisol levels. When stress hormones peaked, the human consciousness surged to the surface. When they dropped, the Lazarus programming reasserted control. He's fighting it, she told me, her voice raw with a mixture of scientific fascination and heartbreak. His identity is using the stress response as a weapon against the integration. Every time the infection tries to fully convert his neural patterns, his own fear and rage push it back. How long can that last? Her silence was its own answer. Through the observation glass, I watched Jonah cycle between states, lucid. He pressed his palms against the glass and mouthed words I couldn't read. Converted, he paced the small room with the fluid, predatory motion of something hunting in a cage. The transitions were becoming faster, more frequent. The boundaries between Jonah and the thing the virus was trying to make him eroding with each cycle. On day 29, Tom disappeared for 6 hours. He left sublevel 3 at 11 in the morning and didn't return until 5 in the afternoon. When Marcus asked where he'd been, Tom said he'd been handling administrative obligations to maintain their cover. His heartbeat, Marcus told me later, had been steady, controlled. The heartbeat of someone who'd rehearsed the lie until it became physiologically indistinguishable from truth. That night, I used Marcus's rerouted security feeds to track Tom's movements during his absence. He hadn't gone to any administrative offices. He'd gone to the communications center on the building's top floor and spent 45 minutes at a terminal with encrypted access. Then he'd visited the campus pharmacy and signed out a set of medications under his federal authorization. Then he'd gone to a storage facility on the building's east wing and retrieved something from a locked cabinet. Something I couldn't identify from the camera angle, but which he concealed inside his jacket before returning underground. I showed the footage to Marcus. His enhanced eyes tracked details I couldn't discern. The medications he signed out. I can read the labels from the pharmacy camera. Marcus pointed at the frozen frame. Potassium chloride, midazolam, vecuronium bromide. The 3 drugs used in lethal injection protocols. The air in the room changed. I felt it shift, thicken, become a medium through which sound traveled differently and meaning weighed more. He's building his contingency, I said. He's building an execution kit. We don't know that's what he intends. Yes, we do, Amir. Marcus's voice carried a certainty that his enhanced perception had earned. He told you on day 1. If containment fails. Those were his words. He's preparing for containment to fail. I sat with this knowledge the way you sit with a wound. Aware of its presence, afraid to examine it directly, unable to ignore it. Tom Rourke, who'd managed our logistics, maintained our cover, shielded us from the outside world, was stockpiling the means to kill us if he decided the situation demanded it. And the most disturbing element wasn't the drugs or the deception. It was the rational voice in my own changing brain that whispered he might be right to prepare. I went to Lena. She was in the final stages of the vector synthesis, her face hollowed by sleep deprivation and the advancing integration that was beginning to manifest as a subtle grayish tint beneath her skin. When I told her about Tom's supplies, she stopped working for the first time in days and sat motionless for nearly a minute. How far along is the vector? I asked. 48 hours from a testable prototype. We tested on Jonah first. He's the most advanced case. If it works on him, it'll work on all of us. And if Tom decides 48 hours is too long? Lena looked at me with eyes that held the cumulative weight of every impossible decision she'd made since the pandemic began. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to act on it. We told Priya. She received the news with the unsurprised calm of someone who'd been waiting for the group to fracture along precisely these lines. Her analytical mind had mapped the interpersonal dynamics weeks ago. She'd predicted a conflict between the scientific and administrative elements of the team. She just hadn't predicted it would involve lethal pharmacology. We need to confront him, Priya said. If we confront him, we lose his cooperation, Lena replied. He's still our interface with the outside world. We still need him to maintain the cover. The cover won't matter if he decides to euthanize us in our sleep. The word euthanize landed with surgical precision. Not murder, not kill, euthanize. The word you use when you've already decided the subjects aren't fully human anymore. Priya had chosen it deliberately, and it worked. It clarified the stakes in a way that no amount of discussion could. We decided to secure the drugs. Marcus, with his heightened senses, would locate Tom's stash while Tom slept and move it to a location only the 3 of us knew. We'd confront Tom afterward from a position of disarmed safety. That night, while Tom slept in his quarters at the far end of sublevel 3, Marcus moved through the corridors with a silence that was no longer entirely natural. His footsteps produced no sound. His breathing slowed to a rate that would have alarmed a physician. The Lazarus integration was refining his body into something optimized for stealth, for hunting. And he was using those predatory gifts to protect us. The paradox tasted like copper in my mouth. Marcus found the drugs in a maintenance panel behind Tom's sleeping quarters, sealed in a medical transport case alongside 3 prepared syringes and a laminated card listing dosage calculations by body weight. Each of our names was written beside a corresponding figure. The handwriting was neat, unhurried. Tom had done this math with the same methodical precision he brought to supply chain logistics and congressional testimony. We moved the case to a sealed storage compartment in Lab 4 and changed the access code. Then we waited for Tom to wake up. He emerged at 6:30, as he always did, and made his way to the small kitchenette we'd established in the sublevel's break room. He poured coffee from a thermos and sat down at the table. Lena, Marcus, Priya, and I were already seated. He read the room in approximately 2 seconds. "You found it," he said. "We found it," Lena confirmed. Tom set down his coffee. He didn't attempt to deny or deflect. He looked at each of us in turn with an expression that I can only describe as resigned transparency. "Jonah asked us to kill him," Tom said. "That was 26 days ago. Since then, he's deteriorated to a state where he can barely maintain coherent thought for more than 90 seconds at a stretch. In another week, maybe 2, one of you will reach the same stage. Then another. Then another. The vector isn't ready. It might not work. And when the last person standing is too far gone to make rational decisions, who exactly is supposed to handle the situation?" "That's not your decision to make unilaterally," I said. "No, it's not. Which is why I prepared the option and waited. I didn't act. I prepared." "You calculated lethal doses for each of us by body weight," Marcus said. "That's not preparation. That's planning. The distinction matters less than you think it does." Silence settled. Through the break room wall, I could hear the faint sounds of Jonah's observation room. The arrhythmic pacing, the occasional impact of fists against reinforced glass. The vocalization that had lost its last traces of language 2 days ago. "Here's what's going to happen," Lena said. And her voice carried the authority that had organized the most ambitious pharmaceutical project in human history. "The silencing vector will be ready for testing in 36 hours. We test it on Jonah. If it works, we treat ourselves and then figure out how to manage disclosure. If it doesn't work, we discuss all options together as a team with full transparency. No unilateral action, no hidden preparations. Anyone who acts outside that framework is removed from the group. Are we clear?" Tom held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I want to say something else," Lena continued. "What you did, preparing those drugs, came from a real concern. I acknowledge that. We are changing. Our judgments are being affected. The integration doesn't just alter our bodies. It alters how we think, what we prioritize, how we weigh risk and consequence. Every decision each of us makes from this point forward needs to be examined through that lens, including mine." It was the most honest thing anyone had said since we'd sealed ourselves underground. Lena was admitting that her own mind, the mind we were all depending on to save us, might already be compromised. The integration might be shaping her choices in ways she couldn't detect. And if that was true for her, it was true for all of us. Tom retrieved something from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. A phone, not his satellite phone, a burner. "I made contact with someone at the NIH, he said. Dr. Raymond Ossie. He was on the Federal Oversight Committee. He's trustworthy, and he has access to resources we don't. You broke containment, Marcus said. And this time, his voice was not low. It was loud. It filled the room with a bass frequency that vibrated in my sternum. I opened a channel. I haven't transmitted data, but we need a failsafe outside this room, and you know it. Lena picked up the burner phone and turned it over in her hands. What did you tell him? That we might have a problem. That I'd be in touch. Nothing specific. Another fracture. Another secret revealed under pressure. I looked at Tom Rourke and tried to determine how many more secrets were nested behind the ones he'd disclosed. How many contingency layers deep his operational thinking went. He returned my scrutiny with steady eyes that gave nothing away. 31 hours later, the silencing vector was complete. Lena held the vial under the laboratory light, a small, unassuming cylinder of translucent liquid that represented our collective last chance. The viral vector inside it was engineered to seek out the Lazarus promoter element in every cell it reached and silence it permanently. In theory, it would halt the integration process, lock the existing insertions in a dormant state, and prevent further progression toward conversion. In theory. We gathered outside Jonah's observation room. Through the glass, we could see him crouched in his characteristic posture, head tilted, body oscillating between stillness and violent, unpredictable motion. The cycles of lucidity had shortened to seconds-long flashes, blink and miss them moments where his eyes would clear and his hands would reach for something only he could see before the cloudiness returned and the predatory pacing resumed. The delivery method is intravenous, Lena said. I need to administer it directly. Someone has to hold him still. Marcus stepped forward without hesitation. The sedation cocktail we used before, I said. We can... Sedation suppresses the stress response. Priya interrupted from her wheelchair, which she'd begun using 3 days ago when her leg tremors made standing unsafe. Jonah's lucidity is tied to cortisol spikes. If we sedate him, we push the human consciousness down and give the Lazarus programming full control. The vector needs to interact with active neural tissue to calibrate its silencing cascade. He needs to be awake. The mathematics of this cruelty was precise and inescapable. To save Jonah, we needed him conscious. To hold him still while conscious, we needed to physically restrain a partially converted, infected human being with strength and reflexes that exceeded normal parameters. Marcus was the only one among us who could match those capabilities. And only because the same pathogen we were trying to silence had enhanced his own. We opened the observation room door. Jonah reacted instantly. His head snapped toward the opening, his body coiling into a predatory crouch, every muscle fiber tensed for either attack or flight. Marcus entered first, his movements carrying the uncanny fluidity that the integration had given him. I watched two partially converted beings face each other across 10 feet of sterile floor. And I saw something pass between them that existed outside the bandwidth of normal human communication. A recognition, a resonance. Two rewired nervous systems acknowledging each other's frequency. Then Jonah lunged. Marcus caught him. The collision was shockingly controlled. Two bodies moving at speeds and with coordination that shouldn't have been possible, grappling in a sequence that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Marcus had Jonah pinned against the wall, forearm across his chest, the older man's feet barely touching the floor. Jonah thrashed. His head whipped side to side. His jaw opened and closed with an audible snap. And then, for one crystalline moment, his eyes cleared. He looked at Marcus. He looked past Marcus through the door at Lena standing with a syringe. "Do it," Jonah said. The words were clear, unbroken. completely human. Lena moved. She crossed the room in 3 strides, found the vein in Jonah's neck because his thrashing arms made his limbs impossible to access, and injected the silencing vector in a single fluid motion. Jonah screamed. Not the vocalization of the infected. A human scream, raw and terrified, the sound of a man who could feel something changing inside him at the cellular level and had no context for the sensation. Marcus held him as the vector propagated, as the engineered virus found its targets and began the silencing cascade. As Jonah's body fought and then trembled and then went still. Marcus lowered him to the floor. Lena knelt beside him and checked his vitals. Heart rate, elevated but stabilizing. Pupil response, reactive. Skin color. The grayish tint was unchanged, but it wasn't worsening. 24 hours, Lena whispered. We'll know in 24 hours. We sealed the room and waited. Tom stood apart from the rest of us, his arms folded, his burner phone a slight bulge in his pocket. Marcus sat on the corridor floor, his back against the wall, his breathing still carrying the controlled rhythm of combat readiness. Priya dictated monitoring parameters from her wheelchair, her trembling hands curled in her lap. I leaned against the observation glass and watched Jonah's unconscious form for any sign of change. Somewhere above us, the world continued its recovery. People were rebuilding. Governments were restoring services. Children were returning to schools. The Lazarin vaccine was doing its work, saving millions because of what we'd built in this very complex. And beneath it all, in a sealed basement, the 6 people responsible for that miracle were waiting to learn whether they'd survive their own creation. At the 14-hour mark, Jonah opened his eyes. They were clear, fully, unmistakably clear. No cloudiness, no cycling. He looked at the ceiling of the observation room, blinked several times, and raised his hand in front of his face. His fingers were steady. Lena? His voice was rough, dehydrated, but coherent, complete. I activated the intercom. Jonah, it's Amir. How do you feel? Like someone disassembled me and put me back together, using a manual written in a language they only half understood. A pause. But I feel like me. I feel like me, Amir. Lena drew his blood through the observation room's external access port, a safety feature she'd insisted on during the original construction. The analysis took 90 minutes. When the results appeared, Priya made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. The Lazarus promoter element was silenced. Every insertion site showed dormant expression. The integration had not reversed. The viral DNA was still present in Jonah's genome, woven into his chromosomes like old scar tissue. But it was inactive, sleeping. The vector had found the switch and turned it off. It worked, Lena said. The 2 simplest words in the English language, carrying the weight of 6 lives and the hope of continued human existence for the people who'd preserved it. We synthesized 5 more doses within 6 hours. Lena went first, sitting on the lab bench with her sleeve rolled up, injecting herself with the practiced ease of 30 years in research medicine. The effect was less dramatic than Jonah's. She didn't scream. She gripped the edge of the bench, went pale, breathed through clenched teeth for several minutes, and then relaxed. Her subsequent blood work showed the same pattern. Promoter silenced, insertions dormant, progression halted. Marcus was next. The vector hit him harder. His enhanced senses had been more deeply integrated than any of our other symptoms, and their sudden suppression produced a disorientation that left him stumbling and nauseous. For 20 minutes, he sat on the floor with his head between his knees, experiencing what he later described as the neurological equivalent of going deaf after years of superhuman hearing. The silence was overwhelming. When it passed, he looked up at me with ordinary human eyes and said, "I can't hear your heartbeat anymore." Priya received her dose and endured the process with the stoic determination that characterized everything she did. Her hand tremors ceased within an hour. She flexed her fingers experimentally, testing the restored neural pathways. And then, without speaking, she wheeled herself to the nearest workstation and began typing manually for the first time in weeks. My own injection was unremarkable. A burning sensation that traveled from the injection site up my arm and across my chest. A period of feverish heat as the vector propagated. And then a settling. A quieting. The bruises would take time to fade, Lena said. The physical damage of the integration process would heal at normal biological rates. But the progression was stopped. I was still human. Damaged, altered at the genomic level in ways that would require years of study to fully understand, but human. Tom was last. He sat in the lab chair and extended his arm. Lena prepared the injection, and then she paused. "Tom." "What?" "Your blood work from this morning." She set the syringe down and pulled up a data display. "Your integration levels haven't changed in 2 weeks." The room stilled. "They've been static, unchanged. Every single reading for the past 14 days. The same values, exactly the same." Tom looked at the data. He looked at Lena. And in that moment, something in his expression shifted so subtly that I might have missed it if Marcus's warning hadn't primed me to watch. "That's good news, isn't it?" Tom said. "Slower progression, more time." "It's not slower progression, Tom. It's no progression at all. The values aren't declining or advancing. They're identical, down to the decimal point." Lena picked up the syringe again, but didn't move to inject. "There's no biological process that produces 14 days of identical blood work. Not unless the samples are being substituted." Tom Rourke had never been infected. The truth emerged not through confession, but through confrontation. Peeled back in layers over the next hour, while the rest of us stood in a semicircle around the man who'd shared our underground prison for a month. His initial blood work? The results that had shown the same integration pattern as the rest of us had been fabricated. He'd substituted modified samples from the original Project Bastion biobank, adjusting the values to show a plausible progression rate consistent with his lower exposure history. Why? Lena's voice was flat, controlled in the way it got when she was managing an emotion that could have leveled the room. Tom sat in the lab chair with his hands on his knees. He didn't look defiant. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a man who'd calculated the expected value of every possible outcome and chosen the path with the highest probability of preserving what mattered most. Because someone needed to remain uncompromised, he said. Someone needed to maintain clear judgment. If all 6 of us were infected, there'd be no one to make the hard calls when the time came. No one to interface with the outside world without risk. No one to pull the trigger if everything went wrong. "You let us believe you were dying with us," I said. "I let you believe I had the same stake, because I needed your trust to keep this operation functional." Marcus stepped forward. Even without the enhanced senses, his physical presence was formidable. Tom didn't flinch, but his eyes tracked Marcus's movement with the alert calculation of prey recognizing a predator. "The lethal injection kit," Marcus said. "The burner phone. The contact at NIH. What else?" Tom held up his hands. "The NIH contact was real. Dr. Osei knows the broad strokes, not the details. He's prepared to mobilize a federal response team if I signal. Quarantine protocols, media management, the whole framework. To quarantine us, Priya said from her wheelchair. If necessary. Yes. The betrayal wasn't violent. It was structural. Tom had built a parallel system of control around us, a net of contingencies designed to contain or eliminate us if the science failed. He'd monitored our deterioration from a position of false solidarity, performing vulnerability while maintaining complete operational clarity. Every interaction, every shared meal, every moment of apparent camaraderie in the dark hours of the sublevel had been shadowed by his awareness that he was the handler and we were the subjects. I thought of Jonah, trapped behind glass in cycles of lucidity and conversion, and of Tom, watching through that same glass, with the detached assessment of a man calculating when the asset would need to be liquidated. "Get out," Lena said. "Lena, get out of this lab, now!" Tom stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at each of us with an expression that might have been regret or might have been the final movement of a chess piece he'd placed long before we'd realized we were playing. "The vector works," he said. "You're cured, or as close to cured as you'll ever be. The only remaining question is disclosure. The world needs to know what happened here, but it needs to know in a way that doesn't destroy confidence in the vaccine. I've been building a disclosure framework with OSE. Controlled release, managed narrative. Scientific publication through peer review, not media spectacle." "You're managing us," I said. "Even now, you're still managing us. Someone has to." He paused at the door. "I know you hate me right now. I accept that. But I kept this team alive. I kept the cover intact. And I gave you the time you needed to develop the cure. If I'd told you the truth, if you'd known I wasn't infected, you'd have pushed me out. You'd have lost your external interface. You'd have been six sick people in a basement with no connection to the resources or infrastructure you needed to survive." He left. The door sealed behind him. The five of us stood in the silence he'd vacated and tried to determine which of his words were true, which were rationalization, and whether the distinction mattered anymore. Lena sat down heavily on the lab bench. Her skin still carried the faint gray tint of the integration, a cosmetic artifact that might fade over months or might persist as a permanent marker of what she'd endured. She pressed her palms flat against the surface and stared at them. "He's not wrong about disclosure," she said. "If this leaks without context, without the cure already demonstrated and documented, it could undo everything." "So we work with him," Priya said. Not a question. "We work with OSE. Tom is a tool. We use him. But we don't trust him again." The disclosure took 3 weeks to orchestrate. Tom, operating now under Lena's direct supervision rather than as an autonomous agent, coordinated with Dr. Osei to establish a framework that would introduce the truth in layers. First, a peer-reviewed paper in Nature Medicine, documenting the phenomenon of chronic occupational Lazarus integration, describing the mechanism, the progression, and the cure without naming the subjects. This would enter the scientific literature as a theoretical possibility, preparing the medical community for the subsequent revelation. Second, a controlled briefing to the Federal Oversight Committee, presenting the Meridian 6's case as a resolved crisis with full documentation. Third, a public statement from Meridian Biosciences acknowledging the risk, confirming the cure, and emphasizing that the Lazarin vaccine's efficacy for the general population was unaffected. The message was carefully constructed. The creators' vulnerability was a consequence of their extraordinary exposure during development, a sacrifice that underscored rather than undermined the vaccine's success. Jonah recorded a video testimony from the observation room where he'd spent his worst days. He stood in the same space where he'd paced as something not quite human, clear-eyed and articulate, and described his experience with the unflinching precision that had always defined his scientific practice. His testimony would be released alongside the public statement as evidence that the cure worked, that the crisis was over, that the heroes were still standing. Marcus returned to his computational work with a quietness that hadn't been there before. The loss of his enhanced senses had left a gap that he described not as relief, but as a strange grief, mourning the absence of perceptions he'd never asked for, but had grown accustomed to. He told me once, in a rare moment of candor, that he sometimes closed his eyes and strained to hear heartbeats he could no longer detect, reaching for a frequency that had been stolen back by his own restored humanity. Priya's hands healed. The tremors disappeared entirely within a week of treatment. She returned to her protein engineering work with a ferocity that suggested she was trying to fill every moment with productivity, as if stillness might allow the memory of helplessness to find her again. She published the structural analysis of the Lazarus integration mechanism as a standalone paper that would become the foundation of a new field of research into retroviral genomic integration. Lena and I spent the final days in Sub-Level 3 dismantling the emergency laboratory. We packed equipment, archived data, sterilized surfaces, working side by side in the space where we'd nearly lost ourselves, performing the mundane rituals of closure. "Do you think about what we almost became?" I asked her on the last afternoon. "Every day? Does it scare you?" She set down the case she was sealing and looked at me. The gray tint beneath her skin had faded to a faint suggestion, like a watermark on paper. "What scares me isn't what we almost became. It's what we learned about what we already were. Tom's deception, Marcus's surveillance, your willingness to accept it, my willingness to command. The infection didn't create those dynamics, Amir. It revealed them." She returned to packing. I stood in the emptying laboratory and considered the weight of what she'd said. The Lazarus pathogen had been designed to optimize human beings for predation. But the hierarchies of power, the calculus of sacrifice, the willingness to objectify others for survival, those had been present in our team from the beginning. The virus hadn't made us into something alien. It had amplified something that was already there. The public statement was released on a Tuesday afternoon. The response was measured. There was fear, of course. Questions. Demands for additional information. But the framework held. The scientific literature provided context. Jonah's testimony provided proof of resolution. The Lazarin vaccine continued its work. The world absorbed the revelation the way it had absorbed every other shock of the pandemic, with a flinch, a breath, and the stubborn continuation of daily life. We were no longer heroes. We were cautionary tales wrapped in scientific triumph. We were the proof that creation always costs the creator something, that proximity to the thing you're trying to destroy leaves marks that no amount of celebration can erase. I still have the bruises. Faint now, barely visible unless you know where to look. Small purple ghosts beneath my skin, where the Lazarus integration left its signature before the silencing vector locked it away. The viral DNA remains in my genome. It will remain there until I die. Dormant. Silent. A passenger I didn't choose, carried in every cell of my body like a language I can't speak but can never fully forget. I don't see Tom anymore. He completed the disclosure process and transitioned to a private consulting role that keeps him at a comfortable distance from the people he betrayed in the name of protecting. Marcus sends me data analyses sometimes, papers he's working on, always late at night, always without personal commentary. Priya published 2 more landmark papers this year. Jonah retired to a house in Vermont and doesn't answer his phone on weekdays. Lena and I have coffee every Thursday. We don't talk about the basement. We talk about new research, about the weather, about whatever documentary one of us watched the previous weekend. We talk around the crater that our shared experience left in the landscape of our lives, circling it without entering, acknowledging its presence through the deliberate way we avoid its edges. I was there the night we saved the world. I need you to understand that. I also need you to understand what it cost, not the weeks underground, not the physical deterioration, not even Tom's betrayal. The cost was knowing what we're capable of becoming, all of us, with or without the virus.